There's something inside you making decisions for your life, and you don't even notice it. And the worst part, it's not your own voice choosing your path. But today, that finally changes. Most people believe they're in control of their own story. But in the silence between one thought and the next, invisible forces decide for them. Old fears, inherited patterns, memories that were never truly seen. That's why you repeat the same mistakes, attract the same situations, live the same pains, as if something keeps pushing you toward the same destiny. The truth, harsh yet liberating, is that most of your life has been guided by what you don't know about yourself. But there is a way out, and it begins the moment you uncover what actually controls you. Today, you will understand how your unconscious manipulates your choices, how your shadow shapes your relationships, and how your ego builds walls you mistake for protection. And most importantly, you'll learn how to reclaim something you lost along the way, the control over your own life. If you feel like you've been living on autopilot, trapped in cycles that no longer make sense, or if your life could be far bigger than it is today, then stay with me until the end. Because this video won't just explain what happens inside you, it will show you how to break free from the forces that control you and take ownership of your destiny. There are moments in life when a person feels something pushing them from the inside. Even when they believe they're in control, it's as if an invisible hand gently touches their shoulders and guides them toward directions they don't fully understand. This silent movement comes from the unconscious, shaping every reaction before thought even appears. The person tries to move forward, but notices they fall back into the same old pattern again. And the more they force freedom, the more something seems to pull them back. That's where the real awakening begins, when they suspect that maybe something has been working behind the curtain all along. And that suspicion opens the door to a journey of self-knowledge few dare to begin. This becomes even clearer when they realize certain decisions weren't really theirs, but came from inherited fears, forgotten memories, and stories that still echo inside them. It's like walking down a dark hallway, guided only by shadows deciding their steps. The ego tries to convince them everything is under control, but deep down, they feel a silent part choosing before they even notice. A simple example is someone wanting to leave a toxic relationship, but always returning, not out of love, but because the fear of being alone speaks louder than logic. It's in moments like this they understand destiny isn't a straight line, but a reflection of everything guiding them without being seen. And this understanding prepares the ground for the next revelation. Imagine someone trying to change their life, but always repeating the same story, as if trapped in an old book that rewrites itself. They look in the mirror and see freedom, yet live as though tied to their own shadows. It's common for them to think, "That's just how I am," believing their path is already set, when in reality it's just emotional patterns they never questioned. To break this cycle, they can start with small practices, writing down daily triggers, observing automatic reactions, reading authors like Viktor Frankl or Carl Jung to understand internal mechanisms. These simple steps begin to weaken that invisible hand directing their life without permission. And the more they observe, the more they realize nothing was ever as accidental as it seemed. It's curious how the unconscious behaves like a movie director no one ever sees, choosing scenes, lines, and emotions. The person believes they're improvising, but the script was written years ago through experiences never processed. This silent control affects their career, relationships, and deepest fears. They avoid opportunities because their shadow tells them they're not enough. They sabotage themselves because the ego fears the unknown. They hesitate because they carry the emotional destiny of others inside them. When they start to see this clearly, a small window of freedom opens, and through this window comes the desire to go deeper, to investigate the source of these invisible forces. When the person finally realizes something inside them has been guiding their actions, a kind of clarity appears. Not frightening, but freeing. They understand they're not weak or unstable. They simply never saw the mechanism working in the dark. This awareness becomes the first real step toward awakening, where self-knowledge stops being a pretty word and becomes a concrete tool for transformation. They begin to notice they don't need to fight the invisible hand, but understand it. And in that shift, new possibilities start to appear, lighting up an inner landscape long asleep. But as they approach this new territory, another silent force begins to reveal itself, one even deeper. There's a voice inside every person that sounds so familiar, they assume it's theirs, but it almost never is. This voice is born from the unconscious, fed by memories they don't remember, criticisms from childhood, and comparisons they never asked to carry. Often this voice says they're not capable, and they believe it as if it were an inevitable destiny. The truth, however, is that this voice belongs to the shadows that shaped their story before they had any choice. The ego reinforces these phrases because it fears losing control, fears the awakening that follows when a person questions who they really are. And in that questioning, something deeply freeing begins to form, the construction of a new identity. This voice reveals itself in moments when courage is most needed. A great opportunity arises, yet they feel an inexplicable fear that paralyzes them. It's like hearing an old recording played so many times, it becomes believable. Many times, this voice disguises itself as caution. Better not. This isn't for you. But in reality, it's just the emotional pattern trying to keep everything the same. To shift this dynamic, the person can start observing the tone of that voice. Is it harsh, cold, critical? If so, it likely wasn't born from them. And this awareness opens a powerful path towards self-knowledge. A common example is someone who grew up being told they had to be strong. Years later, this same person can't ask for help because the inner voice says vulnerability is weakness. But that voice isn't theirs. It's the echo of a culture equating resistance with worth. To break this narrative, they can write a letter to themselves, responding to that voice as if it was someone else. Or they can explore books like The Power of Myth or The Gifts of Imperfection, which help rebuild the relationship with one's own shadow. Slowly, they begin to see that real strength comes from freedom, not rigid control that consumes them. This voice also interferes with relationships. Some believe they don't deserve deep love, so they settle for crumbs. Others believe they must please everyone for fear of being abandoned. These actions don't arise from the soul, but from an unconscious that learned to survive through adaptation. When they question this voice, they begin to see their emotional destiny isn't predetermined. It can be rewritten. And this sense of looming change creates a type of hope that moves everything inside them. Eventually, something surprising happens. They start recognizing when the inner voice speaks from fear rather than truth. They begin to say, "That's not mine." And that simple phrase breaks invisible chains that held them for years. They discover they can replace that voice with a wiser, more compassionate one, aligned with who they wish to become. This awakening doesn't happen all at once. It comes in layers. And it's precisely as they reclaim this internal space that another revelation approaches, a profound truth about the unconscious acting before thought itself. Carl Jung said human beings live as though awake, yet are guided by forces moving long before the first thought appears. It's the unconscious pulling strings, stirring emotions, reviving memories, lifting shadows that shape instant reactions. The person believes they consciously chose that response, that impulse, that silence, but everything was already set backstage. This realization can be frightening because it disrupts the ego's illusion of control, but it can also be immensely freeing because it shows there was never failure, only automatism. And at that point, awakening becomes clearer, like a light slowly rising from within. The best example is when someone overreacts to something small, one innocent comment, and suddenly they explode. It wasn't the present moment, but an entire compressed past waiting for a trigger. This mechanism is so quick it feels like destiny, as if they're doomed to repeat the same emotional pattern. But when they identify that tiny gap between stimulus and response, they find freedom there, small at first, almost invisible, but real, and that small freedom is what begins to reshape the future. To see this dynamic, the person can practice simply observing their reactions without judgment. If fear arises without clear cause, they can note the context, what they heard, what they saw, and where that emotion might come from. Or they can explore readings like Man and His Symbols, where Jung explains how these mechanisms operate symbolically. This makes self-knowledge practical, accessible, almost tangible. They realize they don't need to fight the unconscious, just understand it. And the more they understand, the more control returns to their hands. It's fascinating how the unconscious acts like a subterranean river. It runs silently beneath everything, shaping the visible landscape without being seen. Everything the person considers natural about themselves, tastes, choices, reactions, dreams, is influenced by that hidden current. The ego loves believing it's the captain of the ship, but it's only the narrator of decisions made below. When the person sees this clearly, a sense of humility appears, along with a sense of power. If there's a river running underneath, there's also a way to navigate it. And in that moment, a new path begins to open. In time, the person learns the unconscious is not an enemy. It's simply the guardian of everything that didn't fit into consciousness. And when they start having a conversation with that hidden part, they discover deep insights about their emotional destiny, fears, and the freedom they've always sought. It's like speaking with a version of themselves that's lived silently for decades. And from that dialogue, another dimension begins to emerge, one where the shadow doesn't just influence, it decides. Jung taught that what a person rejects in themselves doesn't disappear. It only sinks into the unconscious and begins acting behind the scenes. This hidden part, the shadow, often makes decisions on their behalf, guiding impulses, desires, and behaviors that seem inexplicable. The person wants peace but chooses conflict, wants love but sabotages it, wants freedom yet repeats the same pattern. It's as though something inside them has its own rules, its own emotional destiny. The ego tries to keep control, but the shadow is old, deep, and determined. And when they recognize this, a new awakening begins. The shadow reveals itself in moments when the person feels fear out of nowhere, irritation without a cause, or a need to please that conflicts with who they want to be. These are forgotten parts asking for attention. Someone who always avoids conflict, for example, may have buried an ancient anger, and that unseen anger starts making choices silently. They enter relationships that disrespect them, not because they deserve it, but because the shadow wants to repeat the story until it is finally integrated. This movement isn't punishment, it's a request for self-knowledge. To recognize this invisible force, the person can observe their extremes, what irritates them too much, enchants them too much, scares them too much. These intense reactions always point to a part of themselves they haven't accepted. They can write down moments of strong emotion and ask, "What does this say about me?" Another method is paying attention to judgments. They almost always reveal traits the person hides. Books like Memories, Dreams, Reflections help illuminate these areas. And the more they illuminate, the clearer it becomes that the shadow doesn't want to destroy, it wants to be acknowledged. The shadow appears in many forms: excessive shyness, disguised arrogance, perfectionism, self-criticism, escape, deep neediness. All of it comes from old experiences stored in the unconscious waiting for resolution. The ego tries to maintain appearances of control, but the shadow works backstage with remarkable precision. When the person understands this, they begin to see why their relationships follow certain patterns, why their fears return, and why their emotional destiny circles the same places. But the key is closer than they think. When they finally face their shadow without fear, something inside them softens, not because the problem disappears, but because they stop fighting against themselves. The shadow, once a silent enemy, becomes a powerful ally in rebuilding life. And as this internal dialogue strengthens, the person begins to reclaim a sense of freedom they had never felt. But just as this reconciliation forms, another silent force enters, something that appears helpful but keeps them trapped. The ego, the invisible general doing everything to maintain things as they are. Fear is a silent architect. It draws paths, closes doors, and builds walls the person doesn't realize they're constructing. Many of the choices they believe are rational are actually the unconscious trying to shield them from old wounds living in the shadow. The ego calls it prudence, but most of the time it's just a desperate attempt to maintain control. Their emotional destiny ends up being shaped not by what they want, but by what they fear. And when they notice this, something inside them trembles, not from panic, but from awakening. Fear slips into the smallest details. The opportunity they rejected, the conversation they avoided, the love that never happened because it felt too risky. They think they're being sensible, but if they look closely, they'll see the same pattern repeating. If they always step back at the exact moment they should move forward, fear is in the driver's seat. To see this clearly, they can list situations they postponed and ask, was it lack of time or lack of courage? This simple question creates an enormous opening for self-knowledge, and through that opening, truth starts to speak. A common example is someone who dreams of starting a business but feels such deep anxiety that they convince themselves it's not the right time. Fear builds perfect excuses, almost seductive ones. It says it's risky, the economy is unstable, they're not ready yet. And they believe it because the unconscious is remarkably skilled at creating convincing narratives. A powerful way to break this cycle is to take small steps. A short course, conversations with entrepreneurs, or starting something small on weekends. These tiny moves bring back a real sense of freedom, the sense their destiny is bigger than their shadows. Fear also shows up in relationships. The person afraid of rejection avoids opening up. The one afraid of abandonment attaches too quickly. The one afraid of vulnerability builds emotional walls no one can climb. All of this is the unconscious working quietly, trying to protect them from any echo of past pain. But what the ego doesn't understand, and desperately tries to hide, is that avoiding pain also avoids growth. When they finally understand this mechanism, they realize fear doesn't want to dominate them. It wants to be understood, and that understanding changes everything. As they learn to walk alongside fear, something surprising happens. The energy once used to run away begins transforming into strength. They realize courage has never been the absence of fear, but movement despite it. And the more they move, the more doors begin to open, and destiny shifts from repetition to creation. This marks the beginning of profound freedom, the kind born when they stop being engineered by fear and start authoring their life. But to sustain this new construction, they must face another silent force shaping them since early on, the influence of the past writing their present. The past never really stays in the past. It stays alive in the unconscious, quietly writing every choice the person makes in the present. Small behaviors that seem natural are actually old responses repeated as patterns. It's as if they carry a book whose pages were written by the shadow, and they simply keep rereading it without noticing. The ego tries to convince them everything is rational, but old emotions decide before they do. When this realization appears, it brings vulnerability, but also awakening, because they finally begin to see the invisible author of their destiny. This becomes clear when the person notices they repeat the same type of relationship, the same conflicts, the same fears. They say, "This always happens to me," but it isn't coincidence. It's emotional memory seeking resolution. If someone grew up needing to please to feel accepted, one day they realize they still do that, even as an adult. This behavior seems like a choice, but it's emotional programming from the unconscious. When they understand this, they see they're not doomed. They're being invited into self-knowledge, and that invitation is powerful. To rewrite this invisible script, they can rebuild their dialogue with the past. One useful practice is revisiting memories that still hurt and describing them as if observing another character, lessening the ego's grip and bringing clarity. Reading books like The Body Keeps the Score or Presence helps them understand how trapped emotions shape decisions. Another exercise is identifying present situations that awaken fear or discomfort and asking, "Who did I react to like this in the past?" These small investigations illuminate deep shadows. And with that, control begins returning gently. The past also shows up in the body. Certain tensions, chronic discomforts, or habits are silent messages from stories never resolved. Someone who lived in constant alertness may struggle to relax. Someone who experienced abandonment may feel anxiety even in safe relationships. None of this means weakness. It simply means the past is still speaking through the senses. As they learn to recognize this conversation, they realize freedom doesn't come from erasing the past, but rewriting it internally. And that rewriting starts slowly, yet transforms entire destinies. When the person finally sees that their present is shaped by what went unresolved, a calm clarity appears. They understand life isn't punishing them. It's inviting them to integrate what they once left behind. And as they begin answering that invitation, old patterns start dissolving. Awakening becomes inevitable. But as this awareness grows, another force appears, one that seems helpful but keeps them within invisible limits. The ego, the silent general insisting on control. The ego is like an invisible general, strategic, authoritarian, stubborn. It believes it knows the best path even when it's leading the person into dead ends. To keep control, it creates convincing stories, flawless excuses, and even a false sense of freedom. But in reality, it's just the unconscious trying to protect them from shadows they aren't ready to face. The ego fears awakening because it means losing its internal throne. And the more the person trusts this silent general, the more their destiny obeys the same old rules. The ego shows up subtly, the need to be right, the impulse to avoid vulnerability, the resistance to asking for help. It's protection built on the fear of appearing weak or inadequate. Someone who cannot handle criticism may actually be defending an old wound stored in the unconscious. For the ego, admitting fragility is dangerous, so it creates masks. But these masks prevent the person from forming deep relationships, embracing new opportunities, or experiencing a different destiny. And slowly, they begin to notice this. A helpful exercise is observing moments of tension, when the person feels the urge to respond immediately, justify themselves, or win an argument. It's almost always the ego shouting. Taking a deep breath, waiting 3 seconds, then speaking gives the conscious mind room to act. Another practice is accepting small micro-failures, such as admitting they forgot something or apologizing even when uncomfortable. These small gestures break the ego's rigid pattern, and when that happens, an unexpected feeling emerges: lightness. It's interesting how the ego tries to trap the person in a fixed identity. It says things like, "You've always been like this," or "This will never change," reinforcing a pattern that only exists because it was never questioned. It's a defense mechanism, but also a prison. The person believes they're limited, yet that belief is just a shadow painted as truth. When they realize they can choose a new identity, fear begins to lose its power. And that moment marks a turning point, an opening towards something much larger. As the person learns to recognize the ego, they see they don't need to fight it. Just noticing it weakens its influence, returning freedom to act consciously. They discover they can use the ego as a tool, not a master. And as this balance forms, something profound happens. They feel they're finally taking back control of their destiny. But in this process of internal recovery, another silent force appears, a pressure shaping their choices just as intensely, the expectations of others. Few prisons are as subtle as the expectations of others. The person grows believing they must shape themselves to be accepted, admired, or simply avoid trouble. The unconscious records every disapproving look, every critical comment, every comparison, and turns them into silent rules controlling their choices. The shadow learns to hide essential parts of their personality, while the ego builds perfect masks to keep everything under control. This way, they construct an identity that isn't theirs, yet they carry it like destiny, and in doing so, freedom slips away unnoticed. This weight shows up in simple moments, saying yes when they want to say no, following careers they didn't choose, staying in relationships that no longer move them, all to match what others expect. It's like living a script written by someone else. For instance, someone who grew up being told they must be responsible may fear taking risks even when their heart begs for change. Another who was always labeled strong suffers alone, afraid of appearing weak. These patterns shape entire destinies, and the person doesn't realize they're not living their own life, but they do feel something is off. And that discomfort is the beginning of awakening. To break this invisible chain, they can start by listing major life decisions and writing next to each one who truly influenced it. Was it them? Fear? Someone else's opinion? This honest review reveals how often other people's expectations took control. A helpful practice is setting small personal goals chosen solely by them, learning something new, changing a habit, reserving time for silence. These small acts reignite inner freedom, and step by step, a new kind of strength appears. It's striking how pleasing others is often disguised fear. Fear of disappointing, fear of losing love, fear of not being enough. And to avoid this, the person gives pieces of themselves away. But the more they yield, the farther they drift from their identity. The ego loves this because it keeps them predictable, controlled, acceptable. But the shadow whispers that something is wrong, that living for others never fills the emptiness inside. When they finally hear that whisper, destiny begins to move differently, aligned with who they really are. When the person realizes they spent years following expectations they never chose, a shock comes, followed by deep relief. They understand they can free themselves, even slowly, even with fear. And this freedom begins with the simple act of being honest with themselves. As they take that step, the chains start to weaken. And as freedom returns, something shifts inside. Pain stops being an enemy and becomes a messenger. Because deep down, every pain tries to teach something they haven't heard yet. Pain is an insistent teacher. It appears when the person ignores signs, repeats patterns that no longer fit, or tries to control something that requires transformation. The unconscious uses pain as a last attempt to bring attention to what was buried in the shadow. As uncomfortable as it is, pain almost always points toward freedom. It's as if something inside says, "There's a part of you here that needs to be seen." The ego tries to silence the message because it fears the awakening that follows. But pain persists only because it carries a lesson that can change the person's emotional destiny. Pain manifests in many ways: constant anxiety, emotional fatigue, draining relationships, a sense of emptiness even when things look fine. Each symptom is a silent reminder that the soul is asking for renewal. When someone stays in a relationship that hurts them, the pain isn't punishment, it's the shadow showing they're worth more than they believe. When they avoid change, pain appears to show they no longer fit their old self. Pain is an invitation to self-knowledge, not a sentence. But to hear it, they must face what hurts. A powerful practice is asking, "What is this trying to show me?" This question breaks the automatic pattern of running away and returns some control to conscious awareness. The person can journal their emotions, talk to someone they trust, or read books like The Courage to be Disliked, which bring internal clarity. These actions show the unconscious they're willing to listen, and when pain senses the message has been received, it softens. Fear loses strength, and a new space of freedom opens. Pain is often the exact place where destiny starts to shift. It appears when the person is about to repeat a pattern once again. It's as if it says, if you continue like this, the story will be identical. Pain doesn't want to destroy, it wants to break cycles. When the person finally understands this, they feel a mix of vulnerability and strength, because taking ownership of their pain is the same as taking ownership of their life. It means stepping out of the past and into something new, even without knowing exactly what it is. And that uncertain step is where true awakening begins. When they realize pain was a guide, not an enemy, everything changes. The person connects with their own story in a gentle, almost sacred way. They understand every difficult emotion was the unconscious trying to heal them. And as they learn to listen to that inner voice, a different kind of courage emerges, one that doesn't come from the ego, but from the soul. And at this moment of reconciliation with their emotions, they begin to recover something fundamental: the ability to take control of their own path. The next step is discovering how to turn this awareness into real action. There comes a moment when a person feels an inner call that's almost impossible to ignore. It isn't loud, but a quiet impulse saying it's finally time to take back control of their life. This call rises when the unconscious realizes they're ready to face what they've been avoiding. The shadow softens, the ego loosens its grip, and the person breathes differently, with more freedom inside. Fear still exists, of course, but it no longer paralyzes. It's an invitation to break old patterns and take ownership of their destiny, even if one small step at a time. This call appears when they realize they can't keep living a small life, shaped by others' expectations. It's when they look back and see how many decisions were made from fear, how many opportunities they avoided, how many versions of themselves were left behind. This awakening doesn't feel like pressure, it feels like clarity. They understand that controlling their life doesn't mean eliminating risks. It means choosing which risks are worth taking. And that choice brings them a quiet, profound strength, a strength that comes not from the ego, but from their essence. To turn this call into action, they can begin with simple, concrete decisions: dropping one habit, adopting another, having a long-avoided conversation, setting a boundary. They can also write a list of small steps, moving them toward the life they want. Studying a new subject, seeking therapy, joining a walking group, learning something they've postponed for years. Each gesture, however small, tells the unconscious they're reclaiming control. And when that happens, destiny begins to respond with new possibilities. It's interesting that reclaiming internal control doesn't make a person rigid, it makes them flexible. They understand freedom isn't the absence of structure, but choosing their own structure. This internal shift brightens new areas of life: healthier relationships, wiser decisions, clearer boundaries. The shadow stops commanding, it starts collaborating. The ego stops ruling, it starts serving. And for the first time, the person sees they can be the author of their story, not just a character bound by memories of the past. As this awareness matures, a serene courage forms inside. They no longer need to prove anything, please anyone, or follow someone else's script. They feel capable of building their own path, even if there's fear, even if the future is uncertain. Because they finally understand destiny isn't something that happens to them. It's something they create. And at that moment of inner strength, a profound realization emerges. If they can reclaim control, they can transform everything from here on out. A new chapter rises, ready to receive this more complete version of themselves. In the end, there's a simple and powerful truth. No one is condemned to live controlled forever. The unconscious influences, the shadow reacts, the ego tries to protect. But now you understand each of these forces. And knowledge, when truly absorbed, changes entire destinies. The question is, what will you do with it starting today? Will you keep following patterns you never chose? Or will you finally take control of your own story, even if it scares you, even if it feels unfamiliar? Because life only changes when you change the way you relate to yourself. Look at your day today. Were your decisions made from freedom or from fear? Do your choices truly reflect who you are? Or are they just automatic responses from your past? And most importantly, what will be your next step now that you finally know what controls you? If something inside you awakened, if some part of you was touched, don't let it fade when the video ends. Use what you've learned. Observe your impulses. Question your reactions. Choose consciously. Small daily shifts create deep transformations, the kind you feel in your body, your silence, your destiny. And before you go, do something that keeps your growth alive. Subscribe to the Mind's Silent Echo channel and turn on notifications. Here, you'll always find clarity, depth, and tools to continue this journey of real self-knowledge, the kind that transforms your life from the inside out. Now tell me in the comments, which invisible force did you notice influences your life the most, and what change do you want to start making today?